things aren't all rosy in Putin's garden. And when trying to suppress what people are getting in Russia and trying to shape the narrative of what we're getting in Europe, things have actually started to go wrong. And some of these bloggers, some of them very close to Putin, who have now been declared foreign agents, that is an invitation to the balcony. He is literally pushing them off the balcony.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today on day 1366, I think it is, of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're privileged to be talking once again to Hamish de Bretton Gordon, OBE, an old friend of the show and an old mate of mine from many years in the military. Hamish, Director of Doctors Under Fire, former British Army Colonel, and a CBRN and bio expert and author of Chemical Warrior, which is all about your life the whole way through, and is a cracking read. I really did enjoy that. Brought up some good old memories of mine. And an old friend of the show. Welcome back to Frontline.
Well, Philip, thanks very much indeed for having me, and I shall be pushing my next book, Tank Command, fairly soon as well.
Well, exactly. I was going to say, when's Tank Command being published? Because we'll bring that out next time.
4th of June, 2026. I've just handed in the manuscript, so hopefully it will happen.
Superb. Well, we'll need to talk about tanks at some stage and how the design might be affected by what's going on inside Ukraine. But, that Tank Command is not the only thing you've written. You're quite prolific in a number of articles you're writing for other publications. But I want to drill into some of those at the minute. One of them, you talked about the crackdown on Z bloggers. And in a recent piece, which it argued that Putin is eating his own supporters by suppressing pro-war Z bloggers. How significant do you think this crackdown is, and why do you think it's coming in? Putin seemed to encourage a lot of these informal or formally informal bloggers that there were. Do you think he's worried?
Well, I think he is a little bit. A whole part of the whole Russian psyche. And the way that the Russians fight wars, quite apart from the kinetic stuff at the front line, is the propaganda and disinformation war, which, the Russians are, to use the word brilliant is probably not the right way, but hugely prolific. You and I probably bumped into it during the Salisbury attack, when the chemical attack on Salisbury, and the tsunami of Russian media coming out that completely swamped British and Western media, and the only thing people were getting was the Russian story. And I always quote that the thing I found most bizarre was when the Russians said that Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, went to Porton Down to make the Novichok, the nerve agent. And I said, had they said it was Margaret Thatcher who actually did chemistry at Oxford, that there was some plausibility. But I think it is the way they do business, and I think these Z bloggers or military bloggers have stepped over the line. And as you say, it's a tacit sort of way that people could criticise in a small way what was happening at the front. But actually, I think it's a realization that that actually things aren't all rosy in Putin's garden. And when trying to suppress what people are getting in Russia and trying to shape the narrative of what we're getting in Europe, things have actually started to go wrong. And some of these bloggers, some of them very close to Putin, who have now been declared foreign agents, that is an invitation to the balcony. He is literally pushing them off the balcony. So I think it is pretty shocking, and it's a realization that part of the campaign is really going as badly as some of the other parts.
Well, talking badly, Maskirovka, this throwing out disinformation or masking is part of Russian doctrine and has been for quite some time. We saw that in Salisbury whenever they immediately tried to blame something that had escaped from Porton Down and elsewhere. But we've been seeing an awful lot of Russian online activity trying to suggest that the Russians are doing better around Pokrovsk than we're getting reports out from the Ukrainian side. Now, the Ukrainians are not immune to a little bit of Maskirovka themselves. And this information operation, or the battle of different narratives, is something that we saw during the Second World War and have seen in other conflicts, but seem to have forgotten about it in the modern era. Do you think what we're seeing out of this uptick in Russian Maskarovka trying to suggest they're doing a lot better around Pokrovsk again is another indication that they are concerned? They're not winning on the ground, and therefore what they're trying to do is attack, at an operational level, attack the will of the people, the will of the Ukrainian military, and do something because they're actually not winning from a kinetic perspective. I was going to say losing, but they're not losing.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely, as you say, it's part of their psyche, it's part of their doctrine, and they're very good at it. And they again, mass has a real value. The quantity idea, and it is interesting. The as you say, the absolute uptick around the Petros sort of where the Russians have invested. Again, it's difficult to get the exact detail, but maybe up to 170,000 troops. A heck of a lot of effort into Petros, which they've been attacking for. We've been talking about this for at least 12 months, and they have made some headway. But the fact that that their bloggers and also some of their sort of Western appeasers who are either sitting in Moscow or sitting in the US are saying the same sort of thing. Is really blurring what is happening on the battlefield. For sure, the Ukrainians are trying to counter, and we've discussed before how effective the Ukrainian Secret Service has been, particularly in its deep operations. Well, it's pretty clear that they're not just confined to kinetic deep operations. The sort of winning the narrative is so very, very important, especially when the fight is sort of amongst the people. That particularly in Ukraine, the civilians are very much part of the battlefield. Sadly, Putin, as I saw him in Syria, views the people and the infrastructure as actually absolutely part of his targeting sets. Now, I think what Ukraine is trying to do is to bring the Russian people, into Ukrainian targeting sets for the very same reason. I always got the feeling in Syria that Putin was trying to subjugate the civilian population so they would capitulate. And in certain areas like Aleppo in December 2016, that's exactly what happened. But it hasn't happened as Putin would expect or had hoped for in Ukraine. It's certainly, everybody is aware it's happening. But they're a country, they have been attacked, and that sort of indomitable spirit, I suppose, that we had in the Second World War in this country is being shown by the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainians are probably thinking, and as an observer of these things, actually this sort of type of activity would probably have a more profound effect in Russia, because most of the Russian population like to be untouched by what's happening in Ukraine. Sure, some of them will have lost relatives in the war. Sure, the price of their petrol and their potatoes is much higher, but they're not hearing loud bangs and crashes every night. And it was interesting. I was just sort of musing about writing another piece earlier on today, and we were talking about ATACMS, and it appears that America has now offloaded or given permission for their newer, longer range ATACMS to be used. And the Ukraine Post was talking about this today and the impact that was happening. But a few months ago, we might remember, and I'm sure we discussed it, that it was around the Tomahawk cruise missiles, and Trump has asked Zelensky whether he's going to put one through the Kremlin window. Now, those sort of ideas, I think, will have a really profound effect in Russia. So absolutely, I agree that the whole disinformation and propaganda campaign at the moment is a finely fought thing. And as you say, it's to have operational and strategic impact rather than at the tactical level. It's sort of, it's just white noise. But at the higher levels, it can be hugely significant. And at the moment, it's a sort of score draw, I would expect. But I think it's up to people like you and I to try and work out exactly what is going on in reality rather than in propaganda sphere, as it were.
Yeah, and the reality is difficult because the Russian military bloggers would give a lot of information out. The Ukrainians seem to have greater control over their mill bloggers and give very little out. We know that the Ukrainians are suffering quite significant casualties, and that's causing anxiety, as it would do. But we know the Russians are losing more. And you've frequently stated that the Russian army is running out of road and cited massive losses, including up to sort of 6,000 tanks. And you've described the Battle of Pokrovsk as and the campaign around it as an absolute failure for the Russians. And we've seen the Russians seem to focus on towns and cities. First there was Mariupol, then there was Bakhmut. Now we've got Pokrovsk. I'm sure the Ukrainians have got another town or city that they'd fall back on and try and get the Russians to focus on this. Do you think their whole approach to the tactical battle is wrong and is an abject failure and will lead to the demise of the Russian tactical capability?
Well, yeah, I mean, you would think so, and it's very difficult, I think, for us sort of Westerners to really understand the Russian psyche. It would appear they have lost over 1 million casualties thus far. When you think that Britain lost, I think it was 340,000 in the Second World War over a 6-year period, then that is almost an unbelievable amount of casualties to take. And we often discuss, how on earth the population puts up with that. Remembering the babushkas, the Russian mothers, actually marched on the Kremlin when they lost just 17,000 in Afghanistan. So it's very, very difficult to explain. But I mean, people put reasons around it that actually, if you want to earn a decent wage in Russia, you go and join the army. And if you survive your 6 months in Ukraine, then your quid's in. But even if you die, your family will get quite a lot of money, and people are happy to do that. And a lot of people in Russia view the Russian army as just a bunch of mercenaries. Now, again, with those numbers, one finds that really difficult. But the Russian tactical battle, it does seem to me, I think it's not really impacting as the Russians think, because, as you say, its defense is all about various positions that you can move to, fall back to. And although Petros would appear to be a critical element to that defensive area in the Donbass, even if it fell, there are a number of other areas. There's still another sort of 20% of the Donbass that Ukraine still holds. And some people are suggesting they fall Petros and they got a free run to Kyiv. Well, I'm not quite sure that anybody believes that, even the Russians. So it does seem strange. But the other element to this is, I don't think they can do much more. As you and I spent much time in our training doing combined arms training with all the other arms, so that you could create maneuver and shock action and all that sort of good stuff. But that took a hell of a long time. That took a year or so to train a brigade. Now, the Russians just don't have that. They've got conscripts and they don't have time to train. So they can do little more than attritional warfare, as in the First World War. And if you're fighting that war, is one thing, but if you're defending a First World War type assault, but with 21st century weapons, then it's not unsurprising that the Russians are getting absolutely hammered. So I think they have no other way of operating. And I suppose the final bit to this, Phil, is that it's the way that the Russians command and control. This is being directed from the Kremlin. It's not being directed from the battalion headquarters and brigade headquarters down in the Donbass. And as we know, when you're that far from the battlefield, it's very difficult to make, if you're at the strategic level, it's very difficult to make tactical decisions because you're so far removed and they take so long to inaction. And the Russian way of command is to push everything upwards. Mission command, as you and I were brought up on, just doesn't exist. Initiative at the lowest levels just doesn't happen. So I think the Russians are just grinding on in the hope that they will last longer than the Ukrainians, and I think until recently, and the ability of the Americans and the others to support. But I think this latest thing with the Americans, allowing and giving or selling ATACMS to the Ukrainians is quite a significant shift. You only have to mention Tomahawk missiles, and Moscow goes into a flat spin. But you and I know that probably they're not going to be the wonder weapon that perhaps people think they are. But it's a build up. ATACMS is a good step forward. So a very long answer to your very good question. Yeah, I do really think the Russians are banging their head against the wall, and they're just hoping that that wall will fall down before they run out of soldiers.
Yeah, well, ATACMS and Tomahawks and all the rest of it show a political will that I think is what really concerns the Russians, because Putin thinks he can control or have a degree of control over Donald Trump at the minute. But as soon as those weapons start going in, he will know in his heart of hearts that he has lost that control completely. But you mentioned command a lot in your last answer, and you having been a commander on the ground in operations, we're seeing an awful lot of reports of where the Russian casualties are very high, and that's killed and wounded. But an awful lot of the wounded, we're seeing reports from Russian military bloggers and other interviews that the wounded are just being left where they lie to slowly die on the battlefield. And if the new troops that are coming in are not getting that training to operate their equipment and operate it together in a combined arms way, what sort of challenges does that give to commanders on the Russian side, considering they are a very hierarchical structure? They don't have this mission command. How do you think they are actually been able to get people to go and do what they need to do? And do you think this is a recipe for an even bigger disaster?
Well, I think it absolutely is. And Philip, when you and I went to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the key thing was about the medical support, the CASEVAC plans, and all the rest of it. And I'm sure you felt the same as I. If you were pretty certain if you got injured, shot or blown up, there was a fair chance that you would be picked up and stitched up, and would have a fighting chance. And the focus on that medical chain was absolutely key. And that one gave one confidence to be able to go forward and operate in the sort of manner that you should have done. But if if I put my own, and I had it not slightly with the Peshmerga, but certainly in Syria, when you sort of knew that if you were in trouble, nobody was going to come steaming over the horizon to pick you up. So that made your decision making rather different. So, but when you look at what the Russians are doing, I can't imagine why. And talk about when injured soldiers, they're pushed back into the front line. And that callous way of dealing with people is completely opposite to anything I think we in the British military, and I'm sure all Western militaries, would understand. You ask how they keep going. Well, there is lots of talk that if they go backwards, they get shot. If they go forwards, they've got a chance they might not get shot. So it's a hell of a way for leadership, and the leadership in Russia seems to be behind the front line troops, making sure they go forwards rather than backwards. So it is absolutely devastating, and you see these stories too often to make you believe that actually at least some of them must be real. I cannot understand it, but I can see that when your best chance of survival is to charge the enemy, you're in a pretty horrific place.
Yeah, and then if we look at leadership at the highest level, I think you titled an article, "This is how dictators fall." And I know you've been looking at your potential options should Putin come under increasing pressure, which there are no indications of immediately at the moment. But what parallels are you drawing from history that you can sort of bring into what's going on at that strategic level in Moscow that's going to put pressure on Vladimir Putin, and what could come next?
Well, yeah. I mean, I sort of surmise that these sort of tyrannies rot from the inside outwards, as it were. And you look at the sort of you look at Stalin. I mean, Stalin allegedly died of a heart attack, and then the Politburo sort of decided who was going to go next. But
they hadn't got high-rise buildings then for him to fall out the window of.
Absolutely, yeah, metaphorically. But those sort of Stalin purges are sort of what we're seeing at the moment. We've discussed with the military bloggers. And then the most recent piece I've written, which only just gone out, is really looking at, there's so many people commentators like you and me on both sides are sort of going, well, we need to be careful what we wish for because whoever comes next could be worse. And you sort of think, oh, that is a hell of a call. So I have a little look and discuss it with people who are more expert in this than I am of what the scenarios are. On paper, if Putin goes, the Mushkin, the prime minister at the moment, should take over. But paper doesn't really hold much currency in Russia, and there are other people within the Kremlin who potentially could take over. And when you look at these folks, and I won't go into a great list of them, but when you look at them and you look at their ideologies and also their desires, they seem to be a lot less sort of focused on the greater good of Russia and the Russian Federation and trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. They seem to be more focused on more sort of selfish means. Somebody told me, look at the sort of watches that all these people wear. None of them are Russian watches. They're all expensive, sort of Swiss and European things. And a lot of these people have, smart chalets in Verbier or wherever, and yachts and everything else. So there's a lot of talk from some of these people about, oh, we're going to nuke the West. And you sort of go, really? You're going to incinerate your villa in the Alps and your yacht and everything else? So it would appear that those who are waiting in the wings are perhaps more interested in their own financial gain. And somebody described to me the Kremlin is really a nest of vipers. But actually, most of them are out for what they can get and the money they can make out of it. So, sure, whoever replaces Putin, when that will be, and the fact that he's been around for 25 years, and the fact that he's got rid of all these foreign agents, shows that that there is very little he won't do to hang on to power. But it just strikes me and others that whoever comes next is going to be less interested on world physical domination and more interested in the price of gold and the price of yachts in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, which axiomatically, in a funny sort of way, is probably the main reason that we want to see Putin out of his position, because the next person might not want to spend all his time fighting in Ukraine and spend more of his time getting as much money as he can possibly gang together. And I say he because the majority of them are men, and the majority of them have extreme far right views, which are pretty shocking.
Oh, I don't think there's a woman in the running at all. And Putin, I think, because he's a wily old man, having been in the post for such a long time, will know the motivations of those that are in his inner circle. And you can see in the past where some have clearly made comments around the financial impact that it's on them personally, and potentially the pressures they're getting from the home front or other places, and then they fall off the back of their speedboats or fall down the stairs or fall out of the 9th floor window, having gone from CEO of a major oil company to taking up window cleaning and not realizing that windows do open, and things like that. So it's interesting to see. But looking at the crystal ball, we're coming into the winter months now when it comes to fighting and everything else. How do you see the next few months playing out?
I think it's going to be a really difficult time. And the fighting season, we always sort of say traditionally about this time has stopped because the weather has got too bad. But I think mentally people are perhaps thinking about tanks and soldiers getting stuck in the mud. Sure, that is part of the warfare, but as we've discussed, there are many other facets to it as well, and they will absolutely keep going. I anticipate the Ukrainians are going to focus much more on the sort of depth battle, as it were, in Russia, and if it is true that the Americans are given the green light to them, particularly with the TACMs, and maybe Tomahawks and others are coming to the fore, then I am sure that Ukraine will try and turn the lights out in Russia, as Russia is trying to turn the lights out in Ukraine. I see the civilians being suffering the most over the winter months, and if Ukraine can get under the skin of the Russian people, then that might well have much more impact than anything else. I expect after the battles, the very fierce battles we've seen around Patros over the last month or so, one would anticipate that those are sort of going to quieten down, but the air war will keep going, I'm sure, at great pace. Whether the lines are going to shift at all, I expect is very much up to President Trump holds a lot in his gift, but then again, so do the Europeans, and we must lean into this as well. And we've talked about the hybrid war with Russia. We've talked about, or we've seen, Russian spy ships being interdicted by RAF aircraft. I think the Secretary of State's been talking about today. I think in this country we need to realise that we are at a hybrid war with Russia, and that will no doubt continue. But ultimately, I expect the only person who can really shift the dial in a meaningful way will be President Trump. Whether he chooses to do that, who knows? But I think the people in Ukraine are in for a pretty the fourth desperate winter they've had to suffer. But let's hope when the sun starts to rise and heat up in sort of the spring of next year, they're in a much better position than they are at the moment.
Well, given the increasing threat there is across Europe and around the world, and the comments from the Secretary of State, and HMS Prince of Wales is just on her way back from deployment to Southeast Asia and all the rest of it. Do you think the British military are ready for the threat that's out there and the potential of what could come?
Well, I think this is a really good question. I'll just put it into two areas, if I may. When we look at the threat, are we up to it? Well, of course, the British military is pretty tiny at the moment. But what we've got, I think, is still pretty good, and the ability to combine armed manoeuvre. I've just, I don't want to plug my book again, but I've just finished it. And there's one particular chapter on the Battle of Arras on the 20th of May 1940, where my regiment, the Royal Tank Regiment, 2 battalions of it, crashed into the side of Rommel's panzer divisions, which so frightened Hitler that his plan is unhinged. He ordered a halt for 48 hours. Now, this was a relatively small force. It was a combined arms force that actually stopped the great Hitler German Nazi war machine for 48 hours, which in our regimental history is very much what allowed the British Expeditionary Force and others to escape at Dunkirk. So even though the current British military is so small, actually, it still has the ability to have at a tactical level, have a strategic impact, I think. And when you put all the other capabilities together, sure. But, as you and I will know, in effect, we've got one echelon, which means once you fired that force, it's pretty much gone. And I think what the country needs to realise is actually it's unlikely that the first echelon, if you like, are going to win any war. You've got to have a follow-on. So I think that is what we really need to understand. The second element to this is this country in a position to protect itself, which I think is the current dialogue happening at the moment. And my answer to that really is, since the end of the Cold War, people have paid lip service to the defence of the UK. When you and I were youngsters, at least we had pamphlets to our doors telling us how to survive a nuclear attack and how to prepare for war. Now, that's all gone. I had a bit of experience doing this in Syria, and actually some of the apps we developed in Syria are now available in Ukraine. So I think the least the government can do is prepare people so that they understand what the issues are, and if people want to, be a bit more prepared, then and they know what to do, then that's probably a good thing. So I think we're not prepared in this country. We've got a small military, which is, you have the military you can afford, and hitherto that's what we've been able to afford. But I wouldn't countenance that it's a soft touch as well. Looking back to the Battle of Arras, you can still have a strategic impact with the tactical force, in my opinion.
Yeah, and the initiative that the British military provides as well. But yes, planning and preparation that is something that is never wasted. But Hamish de Bretton Gordon, it's been a real pleasure talking to you once again on Times Radio Frontline.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.